Welcome, everybody, to South Florida Wellness Network presents Talkin Wellness. We are back. I just want to, before we continue, I just want to say thank you so much for the support on last week's episode. It's been a wild ride. Last time I checked, 120-something views. You guys are awesome. We really appreciate it. That was definitely, actually, I want to give props to Kayla. She was the one that came up with the idea to do it.
No, you can't give props to me. Actually, Diane came up. Yeah, she reached out to me and said, man, I would really like to do Mothers in Recovery. And I said, that is amazing. So thank you, Diane. And thank you, Diane. Virginia, both of you, because you all are just rock star moms in recovery.
Heck of an episode. But through that episode, it inspired a series that we want to start. And this is a series that Kayla and I planned, 2-3 weeks ago now? And we've been slowly building to this moment. We're going to start a brand new series, and it's going to become kind of the bulk of this podcast. It's called My Story Matters. Brief explanation, we're going to be bringing in people from the community, people from South Florida Wellness Network, people who have a story to share. And it's going to be kind of like an interview style where we get to hear their stories. We ask questions for perspective. And the goal is to inspire not only you as listeners, but us as interviewers, the importance of sharing your story, right? One of the biggest qualities of recovery and of well-being is to be able to share it with other people, right? To get that support and get that more specifically emotional support, right? So to be able to build a community where we can actively share these stories of people who have gone through the depths of hell and have come back. It's really powerful, right? So we thought, what better way to start this brand new series than talking about Kayla's story. So as you saw in the thumbnail, where Kayla has a really interesting backstory filled with a lot of turns, a lot of moments of great, amazing things, and a lot of moments of really dark places. So we're really excited to do this. Kayla, I appreciate you so much for being so open and willing to do this. You know that this has been kind of a little baby that we've been trying to make, and then boom, it's happening, and we're here, and it is awesome. So we really hope that you guys are excited for this journey as much as we are. And without further ado, this is Kayla's story.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that intro. And I'm just so happy to be here with both of you and sharing my story. I can't wait to hear both of your stories. So just so you know, they are going to be sharing their story coming soon as well. But there's an interesting thumbnail. You'll see that's tagged along to this podcast, and that in that thumbnail, you'll see there's a picture of a girl, and she's kind of in an orange jumpsuit. She has dark ring eyes, dark spots around her eyes. She doesn't really look too happy. She kind of looks really, really empty. But then on the other side, you're going to see a family picture, and that same girl is in that picture, but the only difference is time and recovery. Yeah. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm super passionate about recovery. I'm super passionate about sharing my story because I think there's so much power in our testimonies, and they have not just the ability to impact others, but they impact us as we tell them, because there's new just healing and just new revelations and connections. And when we share our story, there's just, I don't know, it's just something beautiful that happens. And so before I start, I always have to give glory to God, because by the grace of God, here I am, and there's so many twists and turns in my story where God was just beginning to sow seeds of redemption from the beginning. So we'll get started from, my childhood. I really want to just kind of skim over like what it looked like getting into my active addiction and kind of some of the mental health challenges that came up as I was younger, because I really struggled with a substance use disorder and multiple mental health challenges probably for about 12 years, where my cycle really began to progress, and I saw a lot of just big challenges come up in my life, and so probably from the age, I would say, of 14 to 24 has really been where I struggled most with substance use and mental health challenges. Yeah. And I think when I look back at my childhood, there's a lot of components, that probably led to some of the ways that I was thinking, some of the challenges in my identity, and just figuring out like who I am in this world, and trying to understand my worth and stuff like that. And I really honestly think that all young people go through that process of trying to figure out who they are and, how they fit into the world. And unfortunately, we do live in a world where there's dysfunction. There's not everything is perfect, and so I think as a kid, there's so many different things that can lead a young person to develop ways of thinking, and not just thinking about the world, but thinking about themselves, And so, for instance, if you come from a home where maybe there wasn't a father, or if you come from a home where your parents were divorced, if you come from a home where maybe your parents were divorced, but they also hated each other, and then you kind of felt like you were in the middle of that. Maybe you come from a home where, you weren't taught good values, or you come from a home where you didn't feel as guided because your parents were working super, super late, trying to just make money to, be able to have a roof and food on the table. And so although they were out there grinding, you lacked actually having the presence of adults to guide you through a lot of the stuff in your life. So with all of that context, what I'm trying to kind of get at is that when I started to begin my kind of mental health challenges, I was actually pretty young. And I think that's kind of where it started, because I can remember being like 12, 13 and just having like thought processes that I know now probably were not the healthiest, and I remember feeling very, what we would call like depressed today. I remember feeling like really heavy emotions of like, who am I? Really heavy emotions of like, does anyone care about me? Do they love me? Really heavy emotions of like, where do I fit in? Just the kind of things that I think normally kids really kind of go through. Except for me, I started to feel bouts of, I can't even explain like what the word is, but you would call it depression now, And so the first, I think, signs of that would have been when I started self-harming at a young age, because I did start self-harming when I was about 13 years old.
Were you aware of depression at the time, like what depression was, or you just felt
Not at all. Not at all. I think that that's one of the biggest things when I look at mental health today, and even substance use conditions, is like we've moved the needle a lot because of, at least I know for myself too, and even in the home with my own son, because we're talking about these things.
100%.
When you're
that's
not,
why I ask.
when you're not talking about these things, or you don't have the guidance of like an adult that can kind of share and like, hey, some of these feelings that you're feeling are normal, and you can feel like you can talk to somebody about some of the thought processes that probably are scary to talk about, because I've had some crazy intrusive thoughts that I was like afraid to tell people, and I began actually having suicidal ideation at a young age, but I was afraid to really talk about that. So I really just dealt with it on my own, and kind of held those things in. And just to give you context too of the type of child that I was, I'm an outgoing person, right? And so I've always been a very like outgoing person. I'm also a very like perfectionist type of person. I've struggled with like perfectionism and like having to like do the best, be the best, all of those things. And so from a young age, I was like the straight A student. I was like, just good at everything, very outgoing, very like what you would think of as like a really happy kid. And so I never felt like I had the space to really share in the things that I was struggling with, and a lot of that had to do with like some of my identity. My parents were divorced. I really struggled with that. My dad had a new family. My mom got remarried. The separation wasn't the prettiest, and like, I don't want to go into their business, but sometimes it looks like that. And the unintended consequences are, what the kids go through, because as children, and we talked about it in the previous episode, children internalize those things, so it's almost like, do they not want me, right? Is this my fault type of thing? And I was a daddy's girl always, and I do think that fathers play a huge role for shaping what, little girls look to in relationships. I really do believe that, today. And it's not to put anything like a knock on my dad, but I just think that when we know better, we do better. And I don't think parents I think that parents sometimes are just doing the best that they can, but they don't necessarily are connecting with like, hey, this would probably be the most important thing for me to do for my child, or speak to my child about these things, or be really involved in my child's life. Because the reality is parents, they have their own lives, you know, like whether they're full-time jobs, like, you know, have their own personal stuff going on. And so I think that when there's not that awareness of like, I still need to be like really active in my child's life, I need to like ask these questions, I need to be aware of like what my child's feeling, what are those signs, those early warning signs and things like that, then things can kind of go unnoticed, you know. And so I feel like kind of that probably happened a little bit with me in my younger years, because I was also really good at putting on a show, meaning like I could literally pretend like everything was fine, you know, and that's what I did. I would like, oftentimes and throughout those years, I dealt with everything on my own, and I never wanted to like admit or be vulnerable about like what was really going on, because I was so focused on what people see too. And I think that's a cultural thing, right? Is like you have to always be seen a certain way. And I felt like that a lot in my family, because, you know, that's kind of that cultural background type of stuff. And so no matter what, like it had to be that pretty picture, you know? And so what do you do with that when you're feeling like, you know, the opposite inside, but you don't feel like you have an outlet for that?
Yeah.
So I'm going to shift. That was just giving a little context of, you know, childhood. Throughout my adolescence now, like my teenage years, you take all of this stuff and you put it into like a teenager who's going through puberty and experiencing all kinds of things. At this point, I was probably spending more time with friends than I was with like family and parents and adults, you know? And so
it's kind of normal.
Yeah. It's a normal thing, right? It's a normal thing. That's usually typically what happens. But when I moved at 14 years old. I moved up to Georgia, which was a huge hit to my family, because I was leaving my mom's house to go live with my dad. Mm-hmm. And I know that and I can understand, you know, why it was a huge hit, because, you know, with regard to my mom, like she didn't want me to move, you know, she wanted me to be there with her. I knew my dad was leaving, and I had this like, I just always wanted to be with my dad. Like, it was just like this thing that I had, you know?
Was it like a comfort that he gave you being around? Was it, do you feel like he took care of you more? Do you feel
I don't.
Closer relationship? Or?
No, not even. My dad was more of probably like, my dad was not as around as my mom was. And I think that is why I wanted to be with him.
You wanted to cling maybe to that relationship a little more.
Correct. Yeah. Because, you know, it's hard when parents are divorced and you're like, oh, okay, like it's every other weekend, you know, and then it's even if that, because there may be something that comes up for my dad and then he doesn't pick us up, or, you know, whatever. And so I just think that at that point, I really was like, when he told me he was moving, I was like, I just felt internally like I'm going to lose him. You know, and on top of that, I was going through my own kind of depressive state as a teenager. And at that point, I was like, I just thought like a move would be the best thing, you know, because I just wanted change. I wanted something to change. And I thought if I could change my geographic location, then things would be kind of like fixed in my life, you know. But
I actually relate to you a lot in that, because when my parents went through their separation, I was very similar in that way. I was trying my best to, like, for some reason, I needed some sort of drastic decision making for it to make sense.
Yeah.
So that drastic decision making was, I'm going to pretend like my father doesn't even exist. Mm-hmm. You know, meanwhile, like, I know he was hurting too. And today I see it differently. But back then, I was so hurt and so disappointed at the fact that I was like, oh my God, the second dad in, the second dad out.
Yeah.
So it was like a whole mental thing that I was going through. And immediately I was like, you know what? Excuse the language, but F this guy. I'm not going to do it.
And it's so funny, your guys' perspective too, because my parents were also divorced, but at a way younger age. So I obviously don't care.
Yeah.
And I had other stepdads that have come into my life. You know, I had Nikki's dad, who was Lloyd. And he raised me, I would say. You know, he's the one that got me into soccer and taught me a lot of stuff. And then Peter now, you know, who's completely a father to me now. And I would adopt that completely. So it's interesting how like that could change with different people.
With the dynamic. It is, 100%,
no. Yeah.
And my parents got divorced when I was young, like really young. But so what I remember is, I don't necessarily remember the divorce. I just remember like when when my dad was getting married to my stepmom, and then my mom got married to my stepdad. So I have a giant family. Like I'm one of like 8 people, but it's like the his, hers, they, theirs, whatever, like the whole mix, you know? So it's like, but me and my sister are the only 2 that are like from my mom and my dad, you know, and they had their challenges and their struggles, and like, you know, and I still to this day don't know like the ins and outs of that because that's their business. I just know as a child, and it's just, this is just generally for children, like it's a hard thing to kind of grasp and understand, you know. And you have big feelings about it because you're not really sure like, you know, why this is happening, or like it's sometimes it's just not fair, you know. But it's not to say that like, you know, parents should stay together if there's like good reason for them to separate and get a divorce. So anyways, moving forward, so I moved to Georgia, and you know, I thought it was going to be this like fairy tale type of situation. And one thing I'll tell you that I've learned in my recovery is, and you'll see throughout like kind of me sharing my story, is that, you know, I was constantly looking for a physical solution to a spiritual condition, you know, and I didn't learn that till way later in my journey. But at this time, you know, I can tell you like I've really figured it out, and like the missing piece was God. And so we'll talk a little bit about that.
I need that in a rap lyric right now. The missing piece was God. I said the missing piece was G.
Exactly, because what I've recognized is like, man, there's dysfunction in like every single family. Like there's no perfect family, you know. And so I actually really happen to love and appreciate my family today, but we've gone through such a healing journey together, and I'll talk about that through my recovery process. So I moved to Georgia. Fairy tale, happy, you know, type of situation. When I started in a new school. You know, it was easy for me to make friends rather quickly. I was loving everything about living there. I was loving everything about being with my dad. But again, I moved into another place where there was stuff going on with like my dad and his wife, and they have 3 kids together. And then I kind of added, they have 3 kids together. Yep. And then I kind of added into the mix because now I'm a teenager. Did
you feel like outside of the herd?
Yeah, for sure.
Did they treat you like that, or? I've met people that get treated different than them, like completely differently, and it's like kind of astounding to watch. It's like, they don't like eat with you, and like it's kind of weird.
It was definitely a struggle, I'll tell you. Like
especially as a young girl. I'm sure.
It always has been for me and my sister, you know. And it's like, and I think even in that, like a lot of it maybe it's like unintended stuff, you know. But like as you're again like shaping your view of yourself in the world through like these experiences, and a lot of the time we shape our view and of ourselves through even like our parents, you know, and like how readily available they are to cultivate a relationship, and what does that relationship cultivation look like. So I think that's kind of, it puts a huge pressure on parents too, you know, because like I said, I think in the previous podcast, is like parents are essentially a child's first gods, right? Like you come into the world and you're looking to these individuals as like your safety, like your love, like you're looking to them to fill every aspect of your needs. And so, you know, that's huge pressure to put on parents. And I think every parent will, you know, I don't want to say fail at some point, but you're going to make mistakes. You're going to be in error. You're not going to do that.
You're not going to live up to that.
You're never going to live up to that expectation perfectly, you know? And so I think we learn that as children, as we grow older. And, but when we're younger, we don't really know that. We're just like angry. We're like, you know, this sucks. My parents suck, you know, those type of things, those type of conversations. Everyone goes through it.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I moved up there, you know, they were having challenges in their marriage, and, you know, it ended up becoming, I don't even know how it all ended up evolving to where they were going to be moving back down to Florida, but I wanted to stay in Georgia. I was happy staying in Georgia. I loved being in the mountains. I had already started making new friends. And I felt good about being there. And so, you know, essentially there was a deal that was made, and I stayed in Georgia. My mom had no idea about it. My dad, you know, moved back to South Florida. In retrospect, when I look at that, like, yeah, it's probably was not the best decision, because now I'm, you know, 15, 16 years old, like on my own pretty much, like put into kind of like the care of somebody else, you know, who isn't family. But at the time they were taking care of one of my best friends in high school, and like another young adult, a teenager that didn't have parents. And so we all kind of like moved in. It was
kind of like fostering you guys.
Yeah. So something to along that nature. But at that point, you know, my life really started to take a turn because I felt very independent. And even though like I felt very like grown up, I was not a grown up. And, but I wouldn't have told you that. Like you're talking to me, I'm telling you I'm grown. I make my own decisions and all this stuff. And I felt entitled to that because there was a lot of things that I started to go through at like in my adolescence, including trauma, like in my teenage years, that just made me feel entitled to say like I'm an adult, you know? And I was putting myself in a lot of adult situations and I was always gravitating towards like older people. Yeah. I think I've always been that way. Like people will always tell me like you're an old soul, like you're wise beyond your years, and like I just would develop relationships with like older people. It was very interesting, but that can be dangerous too, right? Depending on the older people that you have relationships with. Yeah. So, you know, in high school is when I really started partying, you know, and essentially it was like, you know, first like to have fun, you know, and go out and have fun. And I think a lot of the time, like those are the things where like we need to educate young people, because young people, we're just looking to have a good time, you know, like we're looking to have fun, like, you know, and that, and some things can lead down a road that we never thought would lead down that road. And so when I think about like my life and how it kind of just exploded, it's like, you know, like hurricane season, how like the water's warm, so there's like different components, and like, you know, the right, you know, storm comes, like rainstorm, and it hits this warm water, and then it starts to kind of evolve, and then it goes over here and it hits this warm water. So that's kind of like how my addiction and my mental health challenges evolved, right? It was like the perfect storm, you know, the perfect water, the perfect components, because in my teenage years, I did go through trauma, you know, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and I didn't know how to talk about it, nor was I willing to talk about it. So what did that do? It caused me to have a lot of internal pain, right? I was already having stinking thinking, right? My thought processes were not the healthiest. So our brains, like you create neural pathways in our brains. So when you create like an unhealthy thinking pattern, it almost creates this neural pathway where like it begins to just kind of be in a cycle where, you know, and
our
so
thoughts create thoughts.
Correct. And so like my thoughts created thoughts, and then my experiences were validating those thoughts. Right. And so as my experiences were validating these thoughts, then I started to internally think these things about myself, you know? And so it's like when you see how that happens, and then now I'm, you know, at an age where I'm also partying, right? And I know I'm not like probably like a normal person or normal. I was not a normal teenager, because like when I took substances, I really liked the way that they made me feel, because they made me feel different than how I felt originally. And so it almost became instantly like this coping mechanism. And when you're using something to cope, and you have a lot of things that you're coping with, you're going to use that in excess, right? And so when you think about it, for me, and when I think about it, I never wanted to be like, hey, you know, in 10 years, I want to be this drug addict that's, you know, incarcerated, homeless, in immense just internal pain, like completely hate myself, have lost custody of a child that I had a teen pregnant. You never expected that like this would be where my road goes. But that's how it progressed, because when I look at what could have been different, probably if there was some intervention in the beginning in my adolescence, you know, and like there was opportunities for kind of even people that what we do, you know, which is why I love what we do, but to kind of step in and begin to question and like speak, you know, and get curious about.
Do you think that you would have been affected by questioning, or do you think you would have just been kind of set on your minds? Because I feel like, I don't know.
Right.
But I feel like if you kind of just stayed in Georgia by yourself without any of your parents, it kind of seemed like you were kind of set.
I was definitely set. Yeah. 100%. I was definitely set. And so I don't know.
Because kids are hard-headed.
We are. I know I am. Okay. So I was a hard-headed kid, you know, and you couldn't tell me anything. But I think the interactions would have had to be been different, right? The engagement, like even how I engage a young person today is not like questioning them. It's really just wanting to get to know them, right? And really taking a genuine interest in who they are and the things that they're going through.
Do you feel like no one took a genuine interest in you back then at the time, and that's why you kind of...
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. When I look at school, right? So like when you think of like what are the places where people could have seen maybe some of the early warning signs, right? Probably school for me would have been like a spot where they could have like something could have been done like differently. And the reason I say that is because like I didn't graduate because I missed so much school.
Yeah,
So if
that's crazy.
Yeah, if they saw if I was missing so much school, right? Every time I did show up to school, I was legitimately either coming down from a high or like extremely high. And I would show up to school like really disheveled. I have my best friend used to like come find me. I would be at like random houses and she would be like, Kayla, come to school. Come on, I'll take you. And I like just never wanted to go, And so it was like, after I was living with, where I was living when my dad first left, I like left there not long and I went from house to house, like living with like different adults.
Were there multiple people that this was happening to, or like, let's say in your school, was this happening to 50, 20, 100 people, or was this like a small minute people like you, like 5?
Yeah,
10?
I think what you're going is, was it like a group of people that were kind of
I want to understand, like, was it like something you were struggling with that like no one deals with, and it's something like it was hard, or was this like something like everybody around you was struggling with?
No, I think there was definitely people that struggled. I have a friend that took his life in high school, also had substance use and mental health conditions.
So do you think maybe going to where you were in that specific vicinity place made it a lot easier to be on? Because I know like Florida has a lot of drugs too, but like
there's
you
a lot
go to
more
other
resources.
places, that's all there is to do.
Right. I definitely think that being in a rural area played a huge role in it, because like we've moved the needle a lot here, like in South Florida. And I know that that's what is trying to be done in that specific place even now to this day.
Resources alone
right,
too.
100%.
Yeah.
So when you think about like people, this is why education and awareness is so vital. I'm so passionate about it, because people, when they don't know what to do, right? And so then they just assume that's just a bad kid, right? Like, and I'm sure that
exactly.
I know that was the stamp on me, right? Like, I get that, I'd been gone to jail before the age of 18 3 times. I was in a federal investigation before I was 18. There's so many things where people were just like, man, that's just a bad kid, And so I can see how like that stigma, or just like those assumptions, and just like you like write somebody off. But that's why the education piece is so important, because I think that behavior tells a story, right? Absolutely. And if you're talking about like teenagers that are having, multiple arrests, that are never going to school, showing up, disheveled or high, like somebody should take a genuine interest,
Absolutely.
And
100%,
and so.
Especially teachers, man, and this is why I'm always a big advocate for teachers, because everybody thinks it's just a 6:30 to 3, kids come in the class, they leave, and that's it. No, teachers have such a crucial role when it comes to the development of a child, and like half of these teachers are there because they really care, because the pay's crap. The benefits are crap. We all know this. Every teacher in this earth will tell you this. My fiance tells me every single time I talk to her. She's a teacher, by the way. So they're there for the passion, and like it's a great reminder to teachers of the importance that they have in their development, right? I had teachers in my life that when I was struggling, they came up to me and they said, "Hey, Chris, I saw that you weren't as active as you normally are in class. Are you okay?" And those were the teachers that I had the closest relationship
right,
to
because they took that genuine interest.
So it's like, if any teachers in the community, or anybody watching this podcast who's a teacher, and has felt, especially these past years, the schooling system hasn't gotten better, right? If you're feeling very like unmotivated, just know that your jobs are important
and you can make a
and
difference.
you can make a difference no matter where you are. I just wanted to pause and say that for a second because I think it's crucial, you know.
It is. And I think that anyone can make a difference, right? Like if you're somebody who's around teenagers or young people or even your friends or your adults, like when you start seeing like early warning signs of like this is different than who this person usually is, or these are things that are like super concerning, like make it your priority, you know, to like go over there and not to be like, what are you doing? But just to be like, hey, like what's going on? You know, I've noticed this and I just wanted to check in on you. Like people just take a genuine interest rather than, you know, kind of, oh my gosh, you know, just judging and being like, this is this person or whatever. But okay, so moving on. So I stopped going to school. I didn't graduate high school. You know, that's part of my story too, because I got pretty much kicked out for not attending school. I got pregnant at 17 with my son Cooper, you know, which was another thing. I met his father at pretty much like a dope house, you know, I was partying at, and I was living there. And I met him there. He was also on drugs. We were both on drugs. He was really there kind of in like the beginning stages of like my like where my addiction like really, really took off. And he was not in a healthy place in his life either, you know? And so you take two, you know, broken people trying to, you know, fix each other and get together. And it's like that tornado and the hurricane coming together and trying to just like do life, you know, and it's hard. I always say like, you know, I didn't even feel like a whole person. And when you take like a 0.2 of a person and a 0.4 and you multiply that, you don't even get a 1, you know, like you just, you're not even close. So there was so much dysfunction there. I was head over heels over him though. I was so in love. I think I was also just looking for a savior. I was looking for somebody to save me from.
This goes back to what you were saying. You were looking for someone to like, I forgot what you said specifically, like take interest or like in your life, you know, 100, want to know.
Absolutely. And relationships, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, like those were drugs for me too, you know, because I was still looking for a way to get out of myself, and I was looking for a way to feel like worthy and validated and enough, you know. And so I was sexually active like really young, you know, when I really shouldn't have been, you know. And so, but I was looking for that love in those spaces. Again, I'm filling this spiritual condition, which I know now, with all of these things that I think are going to fill that void or make me feel better or help me discover who I am, or at least feel like I'm good enough in this world. And so
it's interesting how people love to fill the void with more darkness.
Oh my gosh, isn't it? It's wild, but that's kind of like what we do, you know. And when the thing about it too is you have to think like when we think of our minds and our brains, like a lot of these things let out endorphins, right? And so what happens is like your brain is also like, there's the physiological of addiction, you know, and then there's that like addiction, like when you're the psychological, you know, there's both of the things. And so you have to take both of those things into account. And then I'm a young person whose brain is still developing, but now I'm putting in a lot of
you got to think addiction's like
Yeah.
a neurological disease, the same as like ADD.
Right.
So the same way you want like serotonin or endorphins,
Exactly.
same way a drug addict would want it.
And so essentially, remember I talked about my depression? The first drugs that I started to use were uppers, you know? And so I got addicted to those uppers because they brought me up out of that low, you know? And then that progressed and I got addicted to opioids as well, you know? And so all of these things were happening from such a young age where my brain is still developing. So you can imagine, like, you kind of
Were you predisposed to all this stuff? Like, did your family have a background of?
Yes. So again, family. So predispositions are there too, right? My family has background, both mental health and substance use. My aunt, you know, she died of a drug overdose, unfortunately. Yeah. And then I have mental health throughout. It's all in there. You know, I always say, like, I got every gene in my family that was like the dysfunctional gene. I did. No, I legitimately did. Like,
and as much as it is a cliche to you, be like, you know, like my family had it is
It's a real thing.
It's a real
It's a
thing.
real
It's the
thing.
family tree when you
The
understand
amount of
it.
people that don't believe in this is crazy.
Because
predisposition is a real thing, guys.
It can come off as a crutch or like an excuse for some people, and that's I understand. I completely understand that because I say that all the time for a lot of other things. When people say things, but it really is true. Like it's something you're born with.
I'll give a perfect example of this, and I don't mean to throw my family's business, but it's perfect for what we're talking about. My grandmother is a person who struggles with depression and anxiety. My mother is a person who struggles with depression and anxiety. And I am a person who struggles with depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
3 generations in a row.
Yeah.
And you tell me that predisposition is not a real thing?
Yeah.
That's wild.
No, it is.
That's
for
wild.
sure. It definitely is. And then I think it's also the other components, right? And so
and add to that everything else that was going on.
It's just like with cancer, which is also, right, like that you have to get the early checks if you know that your mom had breast cancer and those things. So there's preventative factors. I was not doing any of those preventative factors, even though I was predispositioned. But I didn't know at the time that I'm predispositioned to all of these things. I didn't know at the time what I was doing was not preventative, but it was actually leading down this road. So without the knowledge and the education that I have today, I had none of this knowledge. You know, I didn't even know what recovery meant. I didn't know any of these terminologies, none of this stuff. So you're just moving through life, and you just think, shoot, there's something wrong with me, And so I'm trying to fix it with every little thing, whether it be a person, whether it be drugs. I did it with money, chasing money. I was just chasing all of these different things to try to fix what was going on with me that can only be fixed internally, you know?
So I'm very interested. So I've met him, so I want to talk about him.
Yes.
Good old Cooper.
Ah, Cooper.
Cooper is a great kid. For those who don't know, that's Kayla's son. I've met him a couple times here at the office. He's a great kid, very energetic, very fun to hang out with.
Yeah.
But I really want to hear. We heard a little bit about it last week in the episode about mothers, right? If you haven't checked it out, please do. Mothers in Recovery. We invited Virginia and Diane to come talk about their experience of that. Please check it out if you haven't yet. It was a phenomenal episode. One of my favorite ones personally. But you kind of jumped into it a little bit, but I kind of would like to hear the full story of, because not to spoil anything, but something happened between you and Cooper that I think a lot of people in the community might want to either have an interest in hearing about or might even relate to you.
Yeah, for sure.
So I would love if you could share that aspect.
Absolutely. Okay, so Cooper's my son. He's 13 years old. He's amazing. He's such a blessing. He's honestly been like, when I got pregnant at 17, okay, and I found out in a horrendous way, right? Like in a car accident, I was drinking, underage drinking, had to go to jail, all of these things, So like Cooper coming into the world at the time would have been like, anyone would be like, that girl does not need a kid. Like my life was chaos, and yet here I was pregnant. And for some reason, like as I laid there in the hospital, I'll never forget it when they told me that I was pregnant. I just knew that I was supposed to have this baby. Like I just knew that I was supposed to have this baby. Now, my thought process after that was really unhealthy because I thought that this baby was going to save me, right? Like it was going to be the one thing, again, the one thing that changes everything, right?
Yeah,
and so, and in a lot of ways he did.
Yeah.
But that's even too much weight to put on Cooper, right?
Absolutely.
Because if I'm not healthy, how can I impart healthy ways to my son? I didn't know these things as a kid. I was just, again, I'm an adult. Now I'm having a baby. I'm really an adult, And so I had Cooper. I remember my pregnancy, I had such a strong will. I stopped every drug that I was doing. I started to save up money. I was like so excited about having him. I was like really just like trying to be the best that I can be. I got my GED that summer. I got even a scholarship from doing that because I was really smart, and that never changed. But I was just Cooper.
You were applying yourself.
Yeah,
I was smart.
Yeah, well, yeah, but like it just. Those things go out the window, when you're just like in survival mode. And I think we didn't even talk about this, is like when you're on drugs, like there's only one part of your brain that's operating, and that is your survival mode. And so you are not thinking rationally. You are not thinking like, if I do this. No, you are just like in survivor mode. And I lived like that. And so I was living a lot in a very like trauma responsive way too, because I put myself in a lot of traumatic situations and had to always be like very alert about like my surroundings and what was going on. And so like, I lived like that for a while. But when I had Cooper, it kind of brought me like level-headed, where I was like really trying to be the best mom that I could be for him. His dad actually got arrested like right when I found out I was pregnant, and he was getting sent off to prison for 3 years. And so I knew that I was going into this, you know, as a single mom. And I knew that it was going to be hard, but I knew that for some reason, and I didn't even have like a faith at the time, that this was like what was supposed to be, you know? And so I had Cooper. Now, when I first had Cooper, I was like strong enough to be able to like, you know, take care of him and not be on drugs and like really, you know, try to fix my life up. I was saved enough money, was able to get myself a place with him, got a job, all of these things. But essentially, you know, I'm still dealing with me. And as time goes, like those depressive thinking starts coming, like all of this stuff that I never dealt with before starts to kind of lay itself out there. And then on top of that, like all my friends are like 18 years old and like partying and like doing all this stuff. So I always felt like kind of outcasted, because now like I'm the only young person with a kid, but I also want to be a young person even though I'm supposed to be a mom and an adult. So is this fight between I'm a kid raising a kid who like really doesn't have it figured out, but I'm just like really hard-headed, you know, and I'll admit that. So, you know, I struggled through that and essentially ended up like falling back into my ways. And I would kind of like, at first I would be like, okay, well, if I just drink, because that's not doing hardcore drugs and everyone drinks, like that's fine, you know. And this is like, again, like the messages that we put out there for young people. But guess what? Kayla didn't drink just to have one drink. Kayla drank to like binge, blackout, drink, you know. And that was just the way that I did things. Like I did things to the extreme. And so it essentially like began just that process of like falling back into my addiction. But now my addiction had switched from like saying, well, at least you're not doing these hardcore drugs, but now I'm an alcoholic, you know. And so again, it's like, you know, that same behavior with different stuff. So I was raising Cooper, and moving a lot with him. I moved back down here. My life would fall apart there, and I'd be living in my car. And at that point, I would call my mom, and I was like, I need to come down, you know, and live with you, because me and Cooper are literally living out of my car. And so I drove down to South Florida, moved in with my mom, was like trying to get my life together. Got into, this is what I would do. I would try to get well for a little bit. Went to Broward College, was like, I'm going to go get my degree in nursing, and, you know, got Cooper, he was down here, into school, like preschool and stuff like that, and just trying my best, because he was always my motivator, but I was always trying to fix things with like external stuff rather than doing the work, but I didn't know at the time. So anyways, down here, I became just like a major alcoholic, you know, partying every weekend, put Cooper down for sleep, and then I'm out and I'm going. And then I would be waking up in the hospital, and my mom would be there like crying. She's like, the cops found you in a bush. Like you were just like completely non-responsive. And I would not remember anything. And it was like, just like things like that would happen. And I would get angry. And when they would try to like confront me, and I would just be like so frustrated. Why? Because there was so much shame that I was dealing with too, that like it was hard to really like cope with things. So I just kept like just wanting to use, you know, because what would happen is like when I would drink, it would like become an escape, you know, and then I would not remember anything. But then when I would wake up, and I would feel that shame all over again. So it was like just that cycle. Yeah. Anyways, they got to a point where Cooper's dad got out of prison, and you know, maybe like a year after that, I wanted to like move back up to Georgia and like try to work things out and be a family. I was always looking for ways to just like fix this by going here, going there, going everywhere. So I moved back up there. He was not doing well either, you know, and so he had, you know, nothing had really changed. Sometimes you go into prison and you actually come out a little unhealthier. Yeah. And that was kind of like the concept here. And so, and then me and him kind of getting back together was just like another, just like explosion, you know? And it was like every single time things just got worse and worse, you know? It wasn't that it got better, it just got worse and it progressed. But when I moved back, I started dabbling back in like the harder drugs. And I started to really do some things that were really unhealthy behaviors and stuff like that. And so, you know, I was always trying to manage like being a mom and like hiding all of this. and showing up as a mom, but then having this other life. So it was like I was trying to live these two lives, but you can't, because this is going to bleed into this, you know, and kids are impacted no matter what. Like you may think that, oh, they're young, they're not going to remember, that is such a lie. I think that kids are impacted from the moment that they're in your
Absolutely.
belly.
Yes.
You know, I'm a firm believer in that. And I've watched even my son's journey and the resiliency and how much he's had to recover himself, you know, through our family kind of recovering together. But to your point of what ended up happening is things got progressively worse. There was a few more arrests on my behalf. Same with his father. His father ended up going back to jail and looking at a prison sentence again. And then I was in and out of jail as well, you know, in the life of drug dealing, and just, it was just chaotic. You know, it was like, everything was like 10 times worse. And essentially I lost custody of Cooper. When that happened, it was like somebody came in, ripped my heart out. Like that's literally what the pain felt like. I wanted to die. Like I just remember feeling like I want to die, even though I knew, and I was so upset and I had so much shame because I felt like I was failing him as a mom. But it was like, he's my only reason for living. You know, he's like the only reason that I wake up every day and like even like and will even try, you know. But I felt like I was so deep and dark and into my addiction and into my challenges. I honestly felt like I was going to die alone as a drug addict on the side of the road, and like some random person would find me, you know. And I literally remember feeling like that's what's going to happen to my life, you know, because I watched my life just like fall apart in like just horrendous ways, you know. And I went through more trauma throughout that too. And it's like, I was just so, and I was beating myself up so much about everything. I like hated who I was. Like I remember one day, like in my place, just like breaking every mirror because I just didn't even want to look at myself. And that's just like the space that I was in. But to your point of like people taking a genuine interest, for some reason, at this point in my life, there was this one person who was that person for me. And it was actually my probation officer. And it was crazy because like I get goosebumps when I think about it, because like at this time in my life, I was like on probation. I had warrants in another state that I had fled. So I was a fugitive in like one state. I was on probation in another state. I was completely strung out on drugs. They removed my son. I was literally evicted from the place I was living in. I was living in my car. I was a complete wreck. Okay. And I didn't know how to get out of anything, nor was I willing to ask for help. Like I didn't, I pushed.
Rock bottom.
Oh yeah, it was rock bottom. It was rock bottom beyond. It was like hell. Like literally I was like living in hell, and I felt like every day was just like, it was miserable.
Yeah.
So my mental state was at its worst. I mean, at its worst. And I could not stop using because I just, like, I remember being like, I don't want to use, but I was so, one, addicted to these drugs, but then two, it was like, I wanted to take my own life, and I needed something to just like take the pain away. And so every day it was just like, you're falling back into that same neural pathway of like the same thing, even though you know, like this is what's killing you. This is what's keeping you from everything want and in life. But it was like, I was stuck here. And so what happened is I created more self-hatred. Every time I used, I hated myself even more. Every time I used, I felt more shame. And so essentially I had a probation officer, and I would go into her office. When I would drive there, I had no license, and I would like get out of the side of the car like I was slick or something.
And like you walked.
Yeah, it was so ridiculous. I'm like, Kayla, what? I would put mud on the back of my plate so cops couldn't run my plate, you know, because we lived in the mountains, and like you could, have mud on your car. And I would go in there, and I usually had like dope in my bra. I was just obviously high. And I would sit down, and I mean, this woman would just like ask me how I was doing. It was the craziest thing, but like took a genuine interest. And I was so used to being looked at and like discussed, not just by people, but by myself, that like when she would like ask me like random, just like questions that were just like literally about like how I'm doing, or like, she would just be like, I'm really worried about you, or like just stuff that like was sincere, that she cared. Like, I just felt like, it was so weird. Like, it was so weird, but that's why I would go. even though I didn't have the money to pay her, I would go because for some reason when I would see her, like I kind of felt better, you know? And so she was that person for me. And that picture, that mugshot of that girl, that was actually my last and final arrest. And I will never forget the night that I got arrested. It was actually my friend from high school's brother who arrested me. He saw me leaving a racetrack. He knows I don't have a license. Again, I had that mud on my tag, and I think it was like 2 a.m. It was pretty late. And shouldn't have been out, and I was not doing good things while I was out, you know, but I remember I worked that night and I was going to meet up with someone, and I remember when he pulled behind me and I was like, crap, you know, like, and I just kind of like knew, and I like pulled into Bilo parking lot, which is like this parking lot. And I just remember taking like this very big deep breath, because like I knew I was going to jail, but I wasn't mad about it. You know, like I think at this point I was so sick and tired that it was almost like a relief, you know, like I'm just
acceptance.
Yeah, it was just like this relief. And actually a couple days before that, I remember like having this mental breakdown, like in the woods, like by myself, like screaming out to God and like being like just so angry, like I hate you, and like why, and I'm like, if you don't do something, then I'm gonna take my life, like I cannot do this anymore, like, and I was just crying because I was just in so much pain. I did not want this to be my life, my son's life, and any of those things. And it was like a couple days later that this like divine intervention happened, and I saw that probation officer in the courtroom, and she looked at me, and I was obviously like in handcuffs. I was not free. I was gonna be getting extradited. Obviously the state that I was, you know, fled from, they were upset. They wanted me to do prison time. It was like this whole thing. I'm looking at all this stuff. Well, she looked at me when we were in the courtroom, and she was like, Kayla, if I could take those handcuffs off right now and you can be free and you can walk out of here, like where would you go? And I just kind of was like, what? You know, like, and I just kind of thought about it. She's like, what would you do? Where would you go? And as she's talking to me, like, a teardrop, and I was not crying. Like I would not cry this time. I like did not feel emotions because I was just so numb of everything, and I like hated my life. I hated everyone. I was just so angry, and like I remember like a tear kind of fell down my face. And what she was doing there essentially was she was empowering me to make a decision. Wow. And she said, I found this place. She's like, you need help. She's like, this is not who you are. You know, this is not this. I know this isn't. There's more to what you need. And she's like, and you need help. She's like, but you have to make that decision for yourself. And she'd done her own research and like found this really great place in Tennessee. And it was like a co-occurring, like a really good treatment center. And she was like, but I want you to make the decision. And so like, she just like empowered me and gave me the power of choosing, like, you're either going to choose your life or you're going to choose this. You know, it was like a fork in the road, but she was like, these are your options. Which really was awesome in that moment, because I knew I didn't really have options. You know, obviously I'm, in handcuffs, and, you know, I know that I'm looking at what I'm facing. And so I had that moment to like really just process through. And obviously like I chose to get help. And that was the offset in the beginning of just like my whole life. And so that's why my recovery date is August 20th, 2016, because even though like I went to jail like a month prior, and I could have used that time, I used it as the day I got out and decided to like go and get help, you know? And so like that mugshot was like the last time that I've ever been arrested or been in a jail, unless it's to bring a message of hope to other women that are incarcerated, which is pretty incredible, you know? And yeah, it's so wild. And when I went to Tennessee, I was there for I was in the residential treatment center for about 4.5 months. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, that was probably the most important 4.5 months of my entire life. You know, the whole treatment aspect was about a year, but like in that intense space was about 4.5 months. And when I say I had extreme breakthrough, like profound breakthrough, you know, and they dealt with my trauma. They dealt with, you know, my mental health. They dealt with my substance use. You know, I learned how to just like work through these things. I gained so much hope from other women that I was there with. Like, it was just a very, like, I recognize that I'm privileged in the type of treatment, the quality of treatment that I've gotten, that people don't normally get that type of treatment. I was able to get that treatment too because, like, this is how good God works. My grandfather died, and he was like a really big part of our lives. And he actually left me an inheritance, but I wasn't allowed to touch it until I was 25. So that money just kind of sat there, even though if I would have probably gotten it earlier, I would have just blown it and
Probably
killed
a good
myself.
thing you
Right?
did it, yeah.
Crazy.
So that money is actually what went to my treatment.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So in essence, my grandfather died, but it saved my life, you know, and that to me was like something so profound too. And like when all of these things were happening and I was having these breakthroughs, like my whole perspective on life started to change, and I started to understand like like the family dynamics, and I started to understand the different components of my life, the trauma, the shame, you know, where I was as a mom. And you know, it was really scary because as I was going through this process, and like it's a lot of hard work, like working on yourself is difficult. And I think that's why most people are afraid to do it, because it's like you're going into like those painful places. You're really looking at yourself, like you're exposed, like you're naked. It's scary, you know, like there's risk there. But my God, is it so worth it? Is it so worth it? Like I would not be who I am today if I did not go there, and if I did not work through those things, and if I did not get really, really honest, you know. But God put like some key players in my life that were there to just support me through that. And that's why support is so huge. And that's why sharing your story is so powerful, and it's so profound, right? There's just this therapeutic alliance that happens when we come together and we actually discuss the difficulties, the complexities. Absolutely. Because we can heal. You know, they say hurt people hurt people. Amen to that, bro. I have done it. I have seen it. I still see it today. But one thing I've learned is healed people heal people, because it is through our healing that we are able to then just express and also like profoundly like touch and illuminate, you know, healing. Absolutely. And it's the same type of thing. So while I was in treatment, I was still looking at the prison sentence. I was on a bond condition. So I got out of jail. My mom was so amazing during this time. She really just like showed up. She would fly out, her and my grandma. They would, because I'm moving from state to state. You know, my custody battle's in Georgia. I'm going into Tennessee. My mom was granted that she was allowed to drive me. So she drove me to treatment. And like, this is when the restoration of our relationship really began. Yeah. And when she took me, she dropped me off, and I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah. So I was going through like the custody stuff, but then I was also going through like court stuff where I was looking at a prison sentence. So that was when I started to kind of be fearful, because I was like, what if I'm doing all of this and I don't get custody of my son back, you know? And that was like a really scary thing for me. And Absolutely. I remember feeling just like so like powerless and like just angry with myself, but like lost without my kid, you know? And so I was like, man, that was like the one thing that I wanted. It was like my biggest motivator, you know?
Not to put yourself in that position again.
Yeah. I was so motivated, because now I'm like learning about all of these things. And then I'm worried about like my kid, the trauma he's experienced. And I'm like, I want to change all of this, you know? And what if I don't get the opportunity to? But this is where God really dealt with me, because I remember being in treatment and I was like angry at God and like yelling at God, why this? Why did these things happen to me? Blah, 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 blah. And I would ask him for this like burning bush experience. I'm like, if you exist, like if you're really real, like we're out in the woods in Tennessee. I'm like, show me a deer, like make a deer appear. I want to see a deer, whatever. And I would do this like throughout my months of treatment, and there would be like no deer, you know, and I would just be like, but I was changing and things were happening, you know, but I was just like looking for this burning bush experience. So fast forward like now 9 months down the road, where I'm now like in a recovery residence. I'm still doing like treatment, but I've like stepped down. But now I'm like getting close to where once treatment's over, I got to go back to jail. I got to turn myself into jail. So I'm getting close to that. The things with the custody battle were not looking that good, because if I go to jail, I do not get custody. So there was like this big thing, and there was other people that were looking after trying to get custody of my son. He was not with me or my mom in that time. And so there was all of this stuff happening that I was powerless to. And I remember being, I would often like go running every single day. You know, that was part of like what helped me. Like I started to realize that like if I focus on some of my physical health, it actually helps me with my mental health. And there's a huge correlation. That's for another podcast. But I would go running every day, and during those runs I would be like talking to God. Like that's just how like my relationship. I was just like very authentic too, because I just come to
driving.
God. Yeah, I just
That's
come to him
thing.
as I am, you know, and just like angry and or scared or whatever. And I remember having this conversation, like just being like, Lord, I'm so afraid. Like, I'm so afraid. Like, what if I don't get him back? And I was crying because things weren't looking good. I had 2 weeks before I had to turn myself back in. I'm already having to plan, like, putting my stuff in storage, potentially looking at prison, blah, blah, blah. My mom's going to have to fly and take me back to jail. And I just remember, like, getting to this point where it's like my heart in that moment, like I had stopped running and it just like kind of fully surrendered. And I had this, like, these thoughts come over me of just like, I've taken care of you thus far. Like, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of Cooper. And I just started to kind of like speak out and say, like, you know what, God, you've brought me this far. And I know you haven't brought me this far just to drop me. If I'm not going to get custody back of Cooper, I know you have a bigger plan. I will be ready when he's 18 to have that relationship. If I have to go to prison, it's going to be to help somebody. I want to do this for you and for me. Yeah, it was finally like where all my motivators were like the kid, the this. It was finally like, I want to do this with you, for you. I'm trusting you with everything.
And that's funny, the relationship I feel like a lot of people have with God. You have that relationship where like you kind of put yourself in the like you become your own God. It's
yes.
Like, give
do
me a
this,
deer.
Get me here. And it's like, do this.
Once you realize like that's not how it works.
Right. It's like that. Yeah.
Having that relationship
it was wild. Right. Yeah. But this is how good God is, though, because God like is just that good. So all of these things are happening. I'm bawling, like tears are down my face. I'm like, I feel the presence of God. Like I literally feel him with me. Yeah. And I like drop to my knees and I'm crying. Like I'm out in Tennessee, like in a wooded area where I was running. And I kid you not, like from me to the camera, which is what, like how many feet is that?
7.
Give a good 6, 7 feet.
Okay, so maybe it was maybe it was 10 feet. I look up and there's a family of deer, like right in front of me. Okay, so like how profound that was for me, and it wasn't about the deer. It was about the surrender, but even just like that in that moment when I looked up and I'm like literally crying, I've already went through this whole process and there's the deer that I've been looking for.
I was going to say that before you said the story. I was like, God's almost like a big satire comedian. Like,
he is.
He just has like life lessons for us that are just like,
I
look back at us and you're like, damn, that's so funny. Wow.
That the best comedian in existence.
That's why I have my deer. Yeah. That's literally why I have my deer, because it was my reminder of like, he in that
cool
moment
to have a tattoo of purpose.
I knew he said, I hear you. I've been here. I've been every tear you've cried. I'm listening. But it was like he waited for the perfect moment where like my heart had already surrendered, and then he kind of like showed me evidence.
Because you might not have received the message beforehand.
Right. Well, it wasn't even the timing. My heart wasn't positioned in the right way. Yeah. My heart at that moment was positioned like in the right way, you know, to where even from that message of the deer, like I knew it wasn't even about the deer, like it was about this surrender, but it was also about, man, how amazing, and like God is so intentional and he's so in tuned to like you specifically.
I remember when I first got into church, and I remember I asked my mom, I was like, it's not fair really like for everybody in the world, because like what if they never hear about God, and what if they never have a chance to go to heaven? And I remember like she told me, she's like, everybody will have a chance, like no matter what culture, religion, lack of food, no matter what, just because of like how how God is. It won't always be linear to everybody, but everyone will have one chance at one point in life to connect with God and have that relationship.
Yeah. Well, and that's why we're called to go out to every nation, right? Yeah. And like, and give the word, you know, and also like speak of hope and, and those things, because those are those moments. And that's why I never ever like turn down a moment to share my testimony, because God is written all over it. Like this, me here, like everything about my life today has been legitimately only prospered because of God.
Yeah, and someone could have never, ever, 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 ever heard about God, and they could stumble upon this podcast and hear your story, and that could be their one. And it didn't even come through like church, you know, like it came through this like non-traditional way, which then led me, because I was even heavily involved in like the fellowship, because there's like fellowships for like Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, where it's like a group of people that like really truly like love you so unconditionally, because they've experienced the depths of hell and they've walked through, so they don't judge, they don't, you know, all this stuff. And that was like my first
kind of experience with recovery besides treatment. And then I remember having like these spiritual, what they call like spiritual awakenings, and just being like, Lord, like at the time I was just like, God, I don't know who you are. I'm really loving what's happening. Show me more. I want to know who you are. And that essentially is what led me to Christ, you know, and like where I'm at today. And so I always say that to say like, you know, our journey through life, I think, is a spiritual journey where we're trying to learn, you know, like our purpose, who we are, who's our creator. Like these are the understandings that I think every human is trying to like figure out essentially in whatever ways they try to find it. But what I recognized in my recovery process is that everything that I had been searching for in a solution for Kayla was God, you know, and it was what God provided. And in that, obviously there was work that I had to do, you know, there's definitely work that comes along with that. And recovery continues because I continue to be refined. You know, I got custody back of Cooper.
Yeah, you did.
That was like the beautiful thing was like after that surrender, I didn't know what the outcome was. So I surrendered not knowing the outcome. Oftentimes we want to know the outcome, and our relationship with God is very conditional. If you do this, I will believe.
Yeah.
But what happens when God doesn't do that? Do you still believe?
Yeah.
And that's why we see it all the time, right? Like people are like, why God?
Why
like,
does this war
right.
happen
And
if
it's like,
God's real? It's like,
right. And so
okay.
it's like and there's going to be things, this is what I recognized in like my maturity with my relationship with God, is like, there are going to always be things that are beyond my understanding, because if I was God, I would know. I'm not God, you know? And so there's so much that I still don't understand, and there's mysteries even in my relationship that I pursue with God. But one thing's for certain is like, he has been so faithful in just like his promises, which has really nothing to do with like Kayla's conditions or outcomes or circumstances, but just essentially in like who he is. Right. And that like in those times he was there to comfort me in those times, and that there's purpose beyond my pain, right? That there's a message out of my mess. And if I chose to just kind of follow and do that next right thing, what was happening essentially is like all of the broken pieces were falling together in a beautiful way. You know, that was like pretty profound. So 2 weeks after that deer situation, I essentially found out that I was not going to have to go to prison. They had followed kind of like my whole journey. Obviously, I was submitting all my drug tests, all my therapy, everything, all the stuff that I'd been doing in that like 9 months. And they were just like, I mean, it blew them away. Like, I guess they saw hope for maybe like the first time in a while, because I guess they hadn't experienced so much of like people like changing their life that quickly, that they wrote like a really nice message and essentially like dismissed my charges. And so I didn't have to go to prison. Then it was like 2 weeks after that I got custody back of Cooper. So it was like, obviously like these were just huge like blessings that were like completely out of my control. Like that was great, God's grace over my life, things that I didn't deserve. Because at this point I was now taking ownership of the things that I did wrong. So regardless, like I knew like, hey, you broke the law. If you have to do the time, you're doing the time, you know, and that was just my thought process in it. Yeah. But that was God's grace over my life, you know, and then it brought me down here to Florida, because when I was getting custody back, it was like God blocked every single path. I never wanted to come to South Florida. I said, I'm never moving there. I'll stay in Tennessee. I'll move back to Georgia, whatever. I'll never come down here. Everything was blocked.
Why did you feel that way?
I don't know. I just always like hated South Florida. It was the weirdest thing.
Were you from here originally?
Yeah, I was.
I feel like
here.
Everyone from South Florida hates South Florida.
Right. And so I just was like, I don't want to go back there, you know? And, you know, I don't even know what that, maybe it was tied to like feelings that I had about different things that happened down here, or like things that I did down here, but whatever. I just didn't want to come down here. God blocked every single path except for down here. I remember being in my therapist's office crying, being like, I have to go to Florida, and I know that that's the choice because everything else is blocked. And so I moved down here. I got custody back of Cooper, moved in with my mom, and that was the beginning of like our restorative relationship too. So now looking back, I'm like, man, I know exactly why you brought me down here.
You'd never
One,
be here.
You restored everything with my mom, but then two, and that's the second thing, when I came down here, Valerie Allen, who was working at DCF at the time, knew my mom, who knew my story through my mom, knew like the whole redemptive side of it, and wanted me to work actually at DCF as a peer specialist. Peers were like this new thing. This was like, almost 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And
it's so funny because right around when my mom started the company is right around that whole peer stuff started happening.
But what ended up happening is because they didn't know how to interview peers, they called your mom. Your mom met me at DCF. She interviewed me. We cried, bawled in that interview office, and essentially I ended up coming here rather than there.
That's wild, man.
Yeah, and so when you look
my
at
mom has a very similar story to you. She really does. I mean, she got pregnant very young, runner away, abusive, a lot of trauma, family back.
Can't wait for that episode.
I know, it's gonna be incredible.
Can't wait for that episode.
Have you like talking to my mom?
Not like that. I've obviously spoken to Susan before. She's my boss. And of course. But not to that degree, and I can't wait for that episode.
Oh my God, me too. However, she's incredible.
Kayla, I do want to ask you this question.
Okay.
As we start to close out.
Yeah.
I got to talk about the elephant in the room.
Okay, let's talk about it.
I'm speaking for myself, but I'm pretty sure I'm speaking for most people in this organization and people that know you in general.
Okay.
The Kayla that you described at the beginning of this episode compared to the Kayla that we see today is two vastly different people.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And I see it. I remember, especially because we've had conversations about your story. Spoiler alert: we tried to do this episode another time. It didn't really go as we wanted it to go. So I've heard your story, and every single time you tell it to me, or you tell it in groups that we work with together, it's kind of a different way of saying it. But the message of anybody is capable of growth and of change. Mm-hmm. It's always so ingrained
felt,
in that story.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to be like, if let's say. I feel that a lot of people are going to watch this episode, or one of two people are going to be people who are currently in recovery, or people who are currently trying to find ways to get out of it, out of the depth, right? Of the void,
of their challenge,
So, as we saw, again, elephant in the room, it's you're two very different people. Like, what would be the one thing?
The biggest catalyst for the change? Or
no, not necessarily. What I'm going more is like, what would be one thing you would tell to those people who are going to listen to your story? Because again, this is my story matters. This is I want people to, like you said earlier, the importance of sharing your story is that we can all pick pieces of it and we can relate to each other and connect as a human race. So what would be the one message to kind of summarize your whole life? And I know this is really tough. But the one message you would give to those people who are currently struggling through the same, similar, or even slightly similar situations to what you're going through.
Wow. Yeah. So that is kind of hard just to sum it up. I want to start with one of the biggest things that I think people struggle with is feeling alone in their specific challenges, right? And so I want to just take that and like completely remove that, because none of us are alone in any of our challenges. Maybe we don't know yet that person that has experienced something similar, because I think we're all unique in our stories anyways. Like nobody has the same exact, there's a lot of similarities and common ground that actually leads to us feeling hope, right? Like that there could be another outcome for me. And I think that's the biggest thing, right? Is having hope that there could be another outcome for you. Now that hope can come in many forms, right? For me, when I think of the catalyst, as you said, is like, it has to be those, for me, it was those cries out to God. Because I think that was the first step in something, right? Recognizing like, I am struggling and I need help. So the first real cry out maybe wasn't to a person, but it was to, and mind you here, when I cried out to God, I didn't really know what I meant by crying out to God. I was just crying out to what you want to call it, the universe, you want to call it whatever, because we're all in a different space in our journey. But it was the first time that I myself admittedly
that you can't
recognized I needed help. Yeah. The next step was then people, right? Because in order to move through that, we need people to help us, And so I think that if I could leave you with one thing, it would be that, one, there's always, like, nobody is too far gone. Like, nobody. Like, I thought I was, and I was not, And I've watched many people, even beyond me, like Cooper's dad, who people were like, there's no way. Like, people look at him as like a miracle beyond me, because his rap sheet would roll out like probably 5 miles long.
Wow.
He's been incarcerated pretty much majority of his life, you know, in prison. Lots of trauma, lots of dysfunction, you know, gang involvement, like all of these things that come with those types of lifestyles. And even he has had a profound transformation and is living a life in recovery. And today, another beautiful thing is he's that person in that picture with my family. So God not only restored both of us in profound ways individually, but he brought back our family together, which is something that's so beautiful.
It's awesome.
It's so, it's exceptional. It's I mean, awesome. I think about it, I'm like, wow, this is such a miracle, you know. So we are now raising, you know, our children together. We're teaching them, we're instilling in them, you know. And I used to be afraid because I used to think like, oh my gosh, Cooper has me as his mom, who, you know, his dad is this, like, there's no hope for my kid. I don't think like that today. There is 100% hope for my kid. And one of the things that I've learned is that your struggles and your challenges are actually really profoundly, like, can actually help you grow in such ways that are like so impactful. I know it doesn't seem like it when you're going through it, but they can actually become like the catalyst of something great. Like if I didn't go through all of those things, I wouldn't be here today being able to do the things that I do and actually have the impact that I have. So sometimes even our struggles feel like they're forever, but they're not, you know. But getting help is the biggest thing, right? Like we can't obviously move from one space to another without help. So I guess like that would be what I would leave people with, is like, you have to recognize that you need help and just have that tiny wee bit of courage to ask for it. But when you do, man, do things start to shift. I feel like God will move mountains and shift the world on your behalf. Now it's a process, you know, like it is a process. It doesn't just happen overnight. And I think sometimes we struggle in a society that is a very like microwave mentality, where we think we could put things in for 30 seconds and we're going to get popcorn.
Well, yeah, think about I know we've gotten very Jesus and biblical here, but like think about the mustard seed, right?
Yeah.
Everybody forgets that, need to have courage like a mustard seed, but everybody forgets that a mustard seed is still a plant. So it needs time to grow. It needs time to develop, you know. It's not like you put it in the earth and boom, mountain, it can be moved. No, it's like it takes time to grow, and it takes time to develop that mustard seed, that faith, that courage to be able to pull through. So that's an awesome analogy.
Yeah. And man, you're worth it. You're worth it. You know, every person has just dignity and value, and like has been put here on earth for a purpose, a unique purpose only to you. Like you're gifted with unique abilities that nobody, Michael can do things that Kayla can't do, that Christian can do things that neither of us can do. Like, and man, there's people that love you, you know, and that would be like my biggest message, because that was what was so hard for me to grasp. But a lot of it was because I couldn't accept that people loved me, let alone God loved me, because I didn't love me. I mean, I hated myself, you know, but there's hope there. And it all starts with that recognition and that asking for help, and just knowing like, no matter what, you are loved by a God, and you may not understand it, but that God loves you so much. And so, you know, the process, it just starts with like taking that first step, you know, whatever that looks like.
Absolutely. Well,
awesome.
Kayla, on behalf of myself, I'm pretty sure Michael and and everybody watching, thank you. This is exactly what I feel you and I pictured when we said we wanted to start this series, and I cannot wait to expand this to more people, different stories, different lives. You know, this year, these past few months specifically have been a really big wake-up call with, at least for me in my life, the importance of sharing your story. You know, and that's why when you brought the idea, because originally it was your idea, it inspired me so much, because I felt it immediately, like, yeah, that's what this needs to be. So we can't wait to keep going. Kayla, one more time, thank you so much. We appreciate your honesty. We appreciate your openness. And we thank you for just trusting us to be able to do this with you today. Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't want to do this with any other two people.
Yes, thank you for sharing. I love you guys. Appreciate you.
Yeah.
So We don't know what the next My Story Matters will be, but we promise you when it happens, we'll give it everything we got to make sure it's the best that it can be. So thank you so much for watching. Kayla's actually going to be gone next week, so it's going to be my Kayla and I. So just because that happens doesn't mean you guys need to like skip the episode. Please watch it.
Yes, they're amazing. I love watching your guys' the broski episodes.
It just goes from PG to PG-13.
Yeah.
That's true. That's actually very true. But once again, we want to thank you guys for watching. Please like, please subscribe, hit that notification bell so you get notified every single time we post an episode or a video. If you're listening to the audio version, please give us a 5-star rating. You have no idea how much it helps. It helps with engagement, it helps to share, and it helps us to connect with more people, and more people can hear stories like Kayla's, stories like our Mothers in Recovery episode, stories like Brian Sims when he came over, and he was kind of like the first version of this that we ever did. And we had so much fun with him in that episode. So the only reason we can do that is if you guys support us and you guys keep sharing what we got to say. So we really appreciate all of you. Have a great rest of your day or week or month or year, and we will see you in the next one.
Awesome.
Stay well.
Bye.